Hello and welcome to BUtalks. I'm your host Bhinduka Yokalingham, and today we'll be interviewing Dr. Sarah-Myriam Martin-Brûlé. She is a professor of politics and international studies, and she works closely with the Model UN program here at Bishop's University. We would like to thank the Experiential Learning Internship Grant Fund, the Bishop's Bookstore, and the Advancement Office for making this podcast series possible. I would first like to acknowledge that the territory in which we hold BUtalks is the traditional and unceded territory of the Abenaki First Nations and the Wabanaki Confederation. In performing this land acknowledgement, we make what was invisible visible and invite the land, the First Nation people, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission into our conversation today. So last week you took part in the first annual Quebec Undergraduate Security Conference. Could you explain to us what you did there?
So I'm part of a research team that is funded by the FRQSC, Quebec funding, the official Quebec funding, governmental funding. And that research team is called International Security in the Globalization Era. And it's composed of professors from McGill, from Université de Montréal, and from Bishop's. And Bishop's has a particularity of being an undergraduate programs. There are a lot of conferences organized for graduate students and also, of course, for professors and scholars. And the idea, with my addition to the team, was to create events to extend learning beyond a classroom, to invite undergraduate students to present their own research and their own thoughts and assessment on issues regarding international security. So we've been organizing this conference for about a year. I had the assistance of John Rubian, who's a student in politics and international studies, and Anthony Martin as well, to contact students, undergraduate students from McGill, from Université de Montréal, and of course from Bishop's, to invite them to share their thoughts in this first interprovincial conference focused on security issues. It was a success. It happened in the building that is occupied by both the CERIUM, which is the International Studies Center in Montreal, and CIPSS, a center on politics and international security. And 25 students were attending the event, at least 15 of them from Bishop's, but also from McGill and Université de Montréal. There were 4 panels on different themes that are related to our own research as team members on international institution, agenda, the new agenda of security at the United Nations, the role of regional institutions as well. And the chairs of panel were Dr. Vincent Pouliot, Dr. Frédéric Méran, Dr. Marie-Jo Hazard, and PhD candidate Jean-François Bélanger. And we really mimicked real-life conferences in the sense that each of the students presented for about 20 minutes, and then there were discussions from the chair, and then opening to the audience. So we really got to not only hear about the students' reflection, but really comment on them, discuss their thoughts more deeply, take the time to go deeper in their understanding of security issues, but also learning about the etiquette of those international conferences. So I think it was pedagogical throughout in terms of putting their thoughts together, in terms of content, in terms of presentation, in terms of format, and also learning how to network, how to connect. So this was a first, which we hope to be a long tradition, and it's also a great opportunity for students to network with peers that are in similar but different programs from other universities, and talk to professors which are world experts on their topics. It's easier at Bishop's because of course we have we have this proximity with students that is incredible, and that's what makes Bishop's unique. But at McGill and Université de Montréal, the classrooms are much wider, much bigger, and sometimes it's harder for students to have these one-on-one discussions with their professor. They're often relate to TAs, teaching assistants, which we don't have at Bishop's. So it was also an opportunity not only for Bishop students, but to talk to other faculty in similar programs, but also to McGill and Université de Montréal students to actually have this opportunity to have those in-depth discussions with their professors.
So the thoughts that they put forward, is it a chosen theme, or they can say whatever they want?
We decided for this first year to open up for papers that were related to our four axes of research. We are we're 5 in the group, and so we invited students to present their reflection on topics related to those. So students, there was a diversity of topics they could address, of course, because the themes are, for example, the new agenda of security in the United Nations. So that can cover security issues related to the environment. It can talk about civil wars, of course, refugees. So there was a wide variety of topics they could address, and they were quite inspiring our students in terms of their originality and the complexity they tackled in the topic they presented to us. So I was very proud of our Bishop students.
It sounds like it's a chance to express what they're passionate about.
Yes.
So how can future students take part in this next time? Because it's an annual thing, isn't it?
Yes, we're going to make a call for papers. We'll see in the next years. I'm on sabbatical starting in July, so we'll see if that will continue next year or it will go to the next year, so in 2019 or 2020 actually. So we'll see. But
impressive. You have recently been appointed as a consultant for the United Nations. Can you tell us more about that?
Mm-hmm. Actually, that was last year. I was hired as a consultant by the unit. It's called United Nations Operation Crisis Center, to author the first field handbook on what is called joint mission analysis centers. So these are centers within peacekeeping missions that acquire and process information that come from the whole of mission, that come from the situation, make sense of it, and the idea is to analyze this information in order to inform decision makers, to help them to better implement the mandate of a peacekeeping operations. I've been working on what is called JMAC, so Joint Mission Analysis Center, since the past 3 years, and in 2015 I attended the UN, so the United Nations JMAC course that is given in Norway. I was then a participant, a student to the course, and that gave me, of course, great information on what the center was about. I was able to connect with the other participants who were active JMAC analysts, and also with the instructors and with the designers of the course who are part of the UNOCC. I gave back feedbacks, comments, and given that I had done 2 field research on JMACs in Central African Republic and in Côte d'Ivoire, they were looking for someone external, I guess, to the peacekeeping operations, but that was also knowledgeable to some extent about the work of JMACs and the challenges of JMACs as well. So they reached out, and I applied, and I was hired to do that handbook. So that required me to go in multi-dimensional missions that have JMACs. Thus when last year in April I was in Congo, in MONUSCO, to assess and the challenges particular to the JMAC there. So I was in Kinshasa, and I went to Goma to see the different JMAC bureau over there. And in May I was in Mali at the MINUSMA, so I was in Bamako. Very different mission. With different challenges. There's a terrorism aspect in Mali that there's not in MONUSCO, so I could see how different challenges for information analysts as well. And then in June I was in South Sudan, in UNMISS, and again, very different challenge in South Sudan. The link with the host government is also very different, so I was also able to interview analysts and also other UN staff members working with JMAC analysts, and to understand the flow of information, the architecture of intelligence, how to coordinate the information that is given to decision makers, how to best assess decision makers in different types of situations. So I went back to New York, and then and I wrote the handbook in Lennoxville. I had 8 weeks to write the handbook, and since September we've been sending drafts of the handbook, receiving feedbacks from the field, from the headquarters in New York, and they should be out in about 3 weeks now. So we're really excited to see that being concrete as a concrete product, the first GMAC handbook.
So how's your experience with the UN helped you with Model UN organisation at Bishops?
It validated many hurdles that were identified, but if you don't work closely enough with the UN system, sometimes you forget how realistic those hurdles can be. To put you into context, I did the Model UN when I was at university doing my bachelor's degree at Université Laval, but that was only a club, and that was some years ago. And of course, I learned about how to write a resolution, the interests of doing that simulation. So how were decisions made at the UN? What kind of procedures were used? And what was the impact of those procedures as well? Because this seems so far away, all those Security Council resolutions that are voted on, and then there's interventions. This whole process of negotiation between all the states in the world was quite a mystery and puzzling to me. So I did that experience in 1999, and then while I did my PhD, I worked on civil war issues. The UN was in my studies, but not necessarily how decisions were taken at the UN precisely. When I was hired at Bishops, I took over Dr. Mickey Edwards, who was teaching the course, and took over a lead to teach our students what was the UN jargon, what kind of words were used, the importance of words in diplomacy, how to negotiate for ideas, how to represent a country. How to represent countries that are not necessarily aligned with our own interests, our own priorities and values, how to make some compromises without compromising the interests of sovereign states. So we all got through this. But still, when I was training the students to negotiate and to write resolutions, the most common question is, how realistic is it, what we're doing? Is it only a game? Is it only rules of the game because they have to have rules? Or is it really the same way it is at the UN? And working closely with the UN for the past year, writing a manual, so something that needs to be very much aligned with the policy, it reconfirmed me in what I had taught the students about the importance of words and how just a single term can change the whole political load and meaning for a policy. So it reinforced and revalidated the rules that are put forward by this course. So it helped, and of course it gives me, in my courses, doing fieldwork is always good teaching wise. It gives me more anecdotes, more examples to illustrate what I'm teaching in course. Sometimes topics that I address can be quite abstract. Having a story or two to illustrate how it works always helps. It's not data, it's anecdote, but still it can help to illustrate complex concepts that I'm using.
Sounds like a big learning experience.
It is always it's a constant learning.
But do you find the students find it easier to agree with each other, or there's always conflicts?
There's no conflicts, I must say. It's not because there's no conflict that there's no that it's easy to agree with one another, which is a different threshold, which is quite different. The students, I must say that the students, especially here at Bishops, now I've been recognized, I'm quite a fan of Bishops, but are quite open to new ideas, and I guess maybe it's because of the sense of community, because the students really bond with each other on this campus, but I found the discussions are very open, and our students are quite creative in finding ways to reach consensus with each other. So it's they're actually a model themselves for the UN, that the UN should maybe take a model on our on our students at Bishops, and the approach to divergent points of view and divergent priorities. I found that our students are quite quick at catching how to negotiate, how to be diplomats. So I found them quite good.
Okay. the current education don't really include information or interaction with real life situations. So I was wondering, should they include more in the curriculum, or is there a line?
Well, there's always a line, but I think it's important, yes. Just as I really believe in internships, I believe in traveling, I believe in going out to see for oneself. That's always important, I think, just to widen our horizon, to face the unexpected, the famous unknown, the unknown, to uncover this. This is crucial, and this is crucial in any steps in life. As a professor, of course, I teach on civil wars, on harsh issues. I just had a segment on recruitment for the Islamic State. These are difficult issues to grasp. They can be very difficult to teach as well, because of our audience is quite diverse and mixed, and that's also the beauty of bishops, I must say. But to some, the concepts of being refugees, the concepts of war, can be very distant, and that's beautiful, that's wonderful. For others, unfortunately, it's very close, and it's very close to their own experience. So it's always to find a balance between how to explain a concept without dumbing it down, with showing the complexity without it becoming complicated. In other contexts, real life experience is important. In that context, I don't want to send any students near war zones, of course. So the use of simulations can be quite good to put students in a virtual environment in which they get some of the constraints, some of the stress that are depicted in an abstract way in the classroom. So in my strategic issues class, there's a semester-long game that we're playing called Statecraft, in which students get to be head of governments, Minister of Defense, they can be part of the UN, and for a whole semester they play their role. I encourage them to play roles that are as far away as themselves as possible, in order to understand a point of view of someone who has different priorities, different angles, different resources, different type of constraints. That really helps to become a better advocate as well for what we believe in, if we understand the logic of the other. In other classes, I will use shorter simulations as well, and with time constraint. Stress reveals character, so I try to put them in a bit of stress to see how they react, so really to identify unanticipated challenges. And I guess when I go on the field, that's also what happens to me. There's challenges that I expect, but there's always those hurdles and difficulties that I don't expect, and sometimes I react in a way that I couldn't have seen myself reacting, and other times I react in an unexpected way, and there's something to learn from that. It's also to try to understand what seems irrational, so to really get to the rationality of what's happening, and to try to unveil and uncover all that. I think simulations do great jobs to do that, to really show, again, the complexity of some situations. And ideally encourage students to do internships and to work safely in organizations, but in order to get closer to realities that are different from their own.
So they get more of a world view.
And a practical experience, and things that you cannot really teach in the classrooms, in terms of the stability, your emotions, for example. It's not only about understanding, it's about feeling, it's about the professor talking about emotional security. That's also something when you do fieldwork, when you do analysis and you are embedded in a situation, for example, trying to assess what's happening in South Sudan while being in South Sudan. Of course, what you're living, the stress, the fear, the heat, the weather, everything affects as well all the information you get and the sense you make out of it. And to be conscious of that can help to take a step back and to make the most of.
So there's a need for self-control and just being aware of your surroundings a lot.
Yes, and to see all the complexity, embracing all the complexity of what's happening. We can teach it, we can have different factors, identify indicators, but it's something else to live it in the field.
So, should peacekeeping intelligence be part of the curriculum or the general public knowledge, so that students of today are more aware of the government's decisions?
Well, it becomes very specialized, I would say, at this point. I think that especially for undergraduate degrees, it's the importance is undergraduate studies is about making your marks. It's like learning the skill. When you learn music, you need to learn the skill. You learn your points of reference when you're undergraduate studies. So learning about what is war and the complexity of defining war, learning about what is peace, the complexity of defining peace. I think that's we have to focus on those core concepts, core issues, and that needs to be grasped and explored in depth during undergraduate studies. I think peacekeeping intelligence, it becomes a bit more specialized, and I think for graduate studies, certainly that a graduate program on peacekeeping intelligence would be very interesting. But that's in the second time, I would say. I would say that first you need to really understand the basics. However, on a class on peacekeeping, for example, or honor seminar on peacekeeping, surely there will be a course and a lecture on what is intelligence in the context of peacekeeping, because often intelligence is linked to national secret, to protect the security of the citizens, and you don't share secrets with all the countries in the world. And what is a bit counterintuitive with peacekeeping intelligence or intelligence at the UN is that the UN is composed of 193 member states. Having all of 193 member states sharing all of their secrets is obviously not the idea. So intelligence at the UN, in terms of the sharing of information, the type of information that is acquired, the goal of acquiring information is quite different. In terms of when we talk about peacekeeping intelligence, it's about the acquisition of information to help implement the mandate of a peace operations. So that becomes very specific, and it comes with all sorts of challenges of how do you acquire that information. At the UN, you don't do any counterterrorism, you don't do a covert operation. You don't do covert operation because all the member states must be in agreement with that operation. So of course, covering covert operations would be against the very spirit of transparency of the UN. But how do you acquire information then to protect populations, to talk to human source without exposing those human source to all kinds of threats and challenges? So these are very specific challenges that are for the UN. If you're using drones, for example, do you use drones only to take images of the conflict itself, of a specific region? What if the conflict is between on a border? Do you take pictures of what's happening on the other state that is not hosting the peace operations? So all those legal questions of sovereignty of states come in the way for very valid reason, but that needs to be tackled. But I think this is on a this can show the complexity, which is certainly of reach for undergraduate students. But I think first you really need to go with the notion of peace, of sovereignty, and once you get that in depth, those notions, then you can get the more complex issues such as peacekeeping intelligence and go back to the basics, saying yes, what is sovereignty? What is the responsibility of states? What are the rights of states? What are the rights of citizens? What is the responsibility of citizens?
Okay. How should we help students learn more about peacekeeping?
I think, well, of course, offering courses help. I also make a point of organizing conferences at Bishops, inviting UN experts on campus to talk about their work. So I think that's very important. And I think Bishops allows us to do that as professors, not only to extend really the learning outside of the classroom. So we have means to invite scholarly experts, some practitioners, some decision makers here, to really show the link between what we teach in class and the day-to-day life when you're actually applying those concepts. What sovereignty means for a decision makers at the UN, what sovereignty means for a practitioner. You can have, again, the concept of it with different authors having different angles, but how relevant are those concepts on your everyday work? I think having those kinds of nexus between the practitioners and the scholars and the experts is great. It's an opportunities to foster for the students to learn more about what's happening at the UN and maybe in peacekeeping more specifically.
Okay, so is there a process or approach by which you emotionally prepare students for potentially uncomfortable, sometimes painful knowledge?
There's always trigger warning before each class. When I start a semester, of course we go through the outline, and I always reiterate how the classroom is a safe space where we need to be careful in not judging one another, not judging a situation, but really trying to be open-minded, to seek for rationality in what we're gonna see. The students, of course, can always contact me and come to see me afterwards, or seek help or support if that triggers something in them. But the idea is really to turn discussions into constructive dialogue between students, and between students with different opinions and sometimes different priorities, different experience as well, that explain such divergent points of view. So, but it's always consciously said and reiterated throughout our lectures, depending on the topics, of course, going from the definition of war to proliferation of nuclear weapons to terrorism or recruitment or the use of rape as a systemic as a tool of war. These are all very difficult issues to address, that needs to be addressed in order to understand why they happen and what makes people take part in those events or be victim of, and how to help and how to understand the situation, more so to understand. And then it's only once we understand better that we can think about doing actions to change things.
So what kind of transformative experiences for both Bishop students and the community do you think are possible when people become aware of larger social issues?
I think the acceptation of the other, of differences, can help a community get together. I think we have a good fabric of a community here in Lennoxville and at Bishop's, having experts coming to talk about their own work, their own challenges, having people that have lived through their own experiences, through those types of difficult experiences, and sharing them with the community. Can help put a face as well, and humanize things that seem so far away from us. I think there's no safer place than Lennoxville in a sense. So when you come back from, of course, obviously from South Sudan or from Kinshasa, but sometimes also in Europe, and you come back to Quebec, and especially here, you feel how safe it is and how precious it is. And it's important that we remain conscious of that. The sharing of experience creates yet another reference for people in the community to humanize problem, to put a face on realities that are far away. That can help maybe mobilize the community towards more actions to help one another. I think that we had refugees coming from Syria and Libya in 2014, just before winter. And that must have been very scary, of course, this whole journey. It was scary, the war for the refugees, but certainly coming here, just the weather, the difference in culture, the difference in codes, having people in the community aware of that journey that our people are taking might help to welcome them better, to help them toward feeling more welcome, to help them through their adaptation, to create bonding, to overcome the language barrier in order to facilitate their integration in the community. So I think that knowledge is always good, to know more about the other. So the other is less of another, but one part of us. So I think this more connection through testimonies and conferences and meetings and can help solidify and expand great communities like we have here.
So you've written a book and it's called Evaluating Peacekeeping Missions, a typology of success and failure in international interventions. Could you describe for our audience what your book's most important points are?
First of all, with a title like this in my name, you can imagine how exhausted you are just presenting the book. It was based on my PhD dissertation called Tackling the Anarchy Within, which I thought was much more punchy than this a bit boring title. But I guess it's might be boring, but more descriptive. So in my dissertation, but of course in the book that followed, I looked closely at 3 conflicts: Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Somalia. And I look at the role of deterrence in peace operations. Deterrence is all about not using force, the possibility, but not the actual use of force. So I looked at how interveners could be more efficient if they had the authority, the capacity, and resolve to use force, but not using force. And whether that was convincing enough for the belligerents to comply with the UN resolutions and with the guidelines they had received to mainly to stop violent actions against civilians. What I found out through my field work, which I did in West Africa, in Ethiopia, and in Ugandan region, in South Africa, was that what works with deterrence, it's less the question of force than that having a deterrent approach to belligerents means that you have to tailor your threats so that it can be credible to the belligerents. To tailor your threats, you need to talk to the belligerents to know what makes them tick, what will make them change their course of action. And to talk to them, you understand much better their motives, their means, their challenges, their constraints. So what's really working about deterrence, it's not so much this question of force and this question of communication with the belligerents, but also with the population. It seemed that those who were the most successful in being deterrent were what I call the great powers, and the great powers are mostly the United States, France, that when they intervene with a deterrent approach, so not intervening while using force, but refraining from using force, but adopting a deterrent approach, made them take actions that would help them communicate better with the population. And by this, I mean that they established radios, they went to talk to the communities, they created pamphlets and posters to explain what the missions was about, their objectives. They did that in Somalia. They would give pamphlets to the population with pictures. It was also written in Somali, so they could read what was happening. So saying why we are here, what is our goal, because uniforms don't mean the same things whether you're in Canada or in Somalia. And in Canada, if you see someone who is in a military uniform, you do not feel threatened at all. Maybe you'll even feel reassured. In some countries, it's quite the contrary. And even though the person has a blue helmet, just a uniform can bring back bad memories. So yeah, that can trigger reactions that might seem aggressive. And of course, the whole vicious circles can ensue. So the point of my book, my initial question was to what extent deterrent work and what type of interveners could be more efficient in peacekeeping operations. And what I found out was it was actually communication and perception of the population that was decisive in making peace operations more or less effective. There is a report that has just been written right now called the Cruz Report, calling for more force, the use of force in peacekeeping operations. And in my assessment of the report, I'm putting the emphasis on the fact that the use of force, it's not so much the use of force, but the restraint from using a force that could be used, and close communication with the population that works better. So that's my main finding.
So you mentioned that you went to all of those countries and you've met military commanders and rebel leaders. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to know, what was it like interviewing them?
We have this desire to categorize actors that have been proven guilty of massacres as monsters. But if you qualify someone as a monster, that means that you take the humanity out of that person. That person becomes unidimensional. And the people that I've met that were involved in atrocities, and there were atrocities, what was mind-boggling is that they were charming, they were articulate, they were smart, they were rational. They were fathers, brothers, sons, loving brothers, fathers, sons. They were people that were loyal to their friends. And that humanity is hard to take, because you really want to hate them. You really want to despise them. You want to see a monster in front of you. You want to just see a green monster with sharp teeth that doesn't look anything like what you know around you. But the reality is that they are both. They are loving fathers, but they are also criminals, and they committed terrible actions. And one of those architects of war that I met admitted right from the start of the interview that he was indeed responsible for organizing systematic rape of 150,000 women. But also, he was very worried about his son's health, and he had an infant son. He had many, many children. By many, many, I mean more than 5. But he had children, and one of his sons had toothache, and he was very worried about his son's toothache, because, of course, in some regions where toothache can become infected, and it can, of course, have big health effects that can be more dangerous than here in terms of access to professional healthcare. All of that to say that, as he was talking to me about the reason and his own motives of committing those atrocities, he was also waiting for a phone call to see if his son had still a fever, if his son was fine. So I had in front of me a caring, loving father, a gentleman. He was absolutely polite, wonderful with me. However, he was still the one that was the architect of all those atrocities, and that is I think important to go on the field to see that, because that's part of the complexities of those situations. And I've just shown in a class that I gave for Dr. Riddell today, the power of rhetoric, and I gave some clips of Charles Taylor testimony at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and you see there a man that is very articulate, that is very charismatic, and that's a portrait of a monster as well. Monsters can also be that, and I think that's important to embrace if we don't want to be manipulated, but also to understand, again, the complexity of those situations, and that gets us a step closer to understand why there's war. People are never stupid. People are always rational. They do the best they can in the situations they have. So our job as scientists is also, and political scientists, is understand the type of challenges there are, what alternatives they are, what are the trade-offs with each of their decisions, and that's what's really interesting as well.
You have to really study them to really understand
and meet
them.
and meet with them as well, and feel the warmth when they say hello. Feel the fact that you do not feel unsafe with them, that you, on the contrary, you still feel very safe, you feel respected. He had done research on me, he knew who I was, and he used words that I used in my own dissertation, so he was very well informed. In order to orchestrate massacres of that scale, you need to be very smart, and that's what's so scary about those people, because they are smart, they're charming, and that's also part of being a monster, is that it's also very human, and that's also very puzzling and interesting.
Okay, so did you have any professors that inspired you throughout your undergrad to go above and beyond with your education?
Yes, I would say so many professors, so many mentors, so many colleagues, so many peers as well. Now I'm trying to remember frantically. There was one professor who is now professor in Université d'Ottawa, Cédric Jourde, who had traveled to Africa, made us read novels in our undergrad course, fiction about different African countries, and jumping in that level of imagination to better understand the poetry, the language, the narrative of different states, of Sierra Leone, of Liberia, of Mauritania. That really opened up horizons, and I got really my interest in Africa for sure. There was then my master supervisor, Marie-Jo Zahar, it was very inspiring in trying to take a step back about issues that were very emotional. And she was inspiring in doing this. There was, of course, Steve Steinman, who was my PhD supervisor, who was very good at helping me keep that step back, staying objectives. And of course, wonderful colleagues and peers that were just so inspiring as fellow students who would go and travel and be smart about it, and we would debrief. You're never smart alone, right? And all those networks that you build as undergrad and then as graduate students stay with you. I'm still in contact with the people that I did my NMUN simulation in 1999, and they're all around the world, and they do different jobs. But those contacts, when you are building your system of reference, are so important to keep and to nourish and to preserve. They keep you grounded. They give you a sense of where you're from, and how you evolve, and where you want to evolve, and the path that you take, and you go back to them, and it gives you perspectives on your starting point, but also on the path and the process along the way, and where you want to get as well. So yeah.
I have two questions. So, do you have any advice to give to aspiring academics in your field?
Well, okay, maybe I do actually. Okay. And especially in light of the security conference for undergraduate students, there's a lot of resources and opportunities put in place for graduate students, for master's students, PhD students, because they are meant to tackle more complex issues in undergrads, in the sense that in undergraduate degrees you embrace the core concepts. I think that in events of Reunited or events involving undergraduate students always prove to be so rich, so insightful in terms of learning from our students, in terms of having questions that you wouldn't get from graduate students. I think that never underestimate an undergrad. That's what would be my advice. And even though there's a lot of resources for graduate students, we need to continue investing in undergraduate studies and making as much opportunities to learn beyond the classroom at that level of university, because these are, it's the beginning of a path, whether it be academic or professional. Students are engaged. You need to nourish that engagement, that interest, and whatever it is that interests them in terms of topics, and they have the energy, and they are so inspiring in terms of all the worlds that are possible. So investing in opportunities for undergraduate studies, that would be my advice for fellow academics.
Undergraduates are the future.
Yeah, they are.
How did you use the skills that you were building as an undergraduate to extend your learning outside the classroom?
I switched universities when I was an undergraduate student. I started at Laval University, then I went to Université de Montréal, and then I did an exchange in France. Adapting, keeping an open mind, changing friends, building networks, expanding networks. These are skills that I acquired, honed, and built upon during my career. But being this level of openness and adapting to different system, going with different types of structure, different type of approach to education, and keeping an open mind with regards to those different types of educations. For example, in France, seminars or courses or lectures are not delivered the same way as they are here. And the approach is also very different in terms of pedagogy. For example, there's not the same kind of investment in pedagogical techniques, or not anyway when I was an undergraduate student. But making the most of those experiences and trying to see the benefits in all of that, I think that helps. So in terms of adapting, networking, and making the most of the education instruction that is offered to you. I think these are things that I've continued building on and hold on to.
One final question. So what fuels you mentally and physically? Because you're always busy. How do you manage your time and efficiently organize everything?
Having kids kind of forces you to do that. So the love of my kids and my desire to spend time with them, of course, so that's a priority that keeps me organized. But what fuels me is really my undergrad students and the level of energy you have in the classrooms, the passion of students, the interest they have. And it's always so rewarding, because even when you don't have the energy anymore to prepare a course and you prepare it with your last grain of energy and you come in class and you deliver your lecture and you have questions, follow-up questions, students emailing you because they were interested, you spark something. So that magic that happens in a classroom, the chemistry of common desire to know more, to understand more, to go beyond the headlines, to go beyond those broad and abstract concept, and this quest for understanding keeps me going and keeps me want to organize more things and to do more things with and for undergraduate students. So I think I'm very passionate about bishops and about students as well. So that keeps me going. Like this wonderful energy that I just want to fuel and
that
going.
Passion and encouragement. And
it is, yeah. And students here are very good at forcing you to be passionate because they are themselves, so you just want to keep up with that passion and fuel it some more, pass it on.
So if you would like to read Dr. Martin-Brûlé's book, Evaluating Peacekeeping Missions, A Typology of Success and Failure in International Interventions, you can find it on Amazon as a physical copy or ebook, or you can go on the Routledge website for a paperback or an ebook. And the links to the website will be included in the description of this podcast. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Reason why is more than